frisk. Hey, whoa, take your business elsewhere. Get out of my restaurant right now. Don't sit here eating our food while you harass my staff. Out, pay your bill.
The confrontation happened at 10:45 a.m. on a busy Saturday morning in the dining room of Quick Eats restaurant in Minnesota. What started as 3 off-duty ICE.
It was 12:34 p.m. on a Friday when cell phone cameras from at least 4 customers captured something that would go viral within hours and transform a small family diner in Phoenix, Arizona into the center of national debate about power, dignity, and where the line between federal authority and abuse begins. A middle-aged white woman in a green apron, order notebook in hand, was pointing directly at 2 ICE agents in tactical vests sitting in a window booth and telling them to leave her restaurant. The agents who had just been eating looked at her with a mixture of surprise and arrogance, apparently unable to process that someone was actually asking them to leave. The entire restaurant had stopped. Servers stopped serving. Cooks came out of the kitchen. Other customers, some filming, all watching, were witnessing something that rarely happened in public. Someone with less institutional power looking directly at armed federal agents and saying no. What had led to this moment started 32 minutes earlier when a young black waitress named Keisha Williams had approached those same agents' table to take their order, and one of them had decided that a federal vest gave him the right to put her through something no employee should have to endure to earn her paycheck. And the manager now expelling those agents, Sandra Kowalski, had spent 17 years building a reputation for a restaurant where every employee was treated with dignity. She wasn't about to let that reputation be destroyed by 2 men who confused a tactical vest with permission to treat people as less than human. Before we dive into this completely extraordinary story, tell me something. Where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, hit that subscribe button now, because stories like this need to be shared, need to be remembered, need to inspire other people to do the same when the time comes. You won't want to miss a single second of what happens next. Kowalski's Diner had existed for 23 years on the same corner of Camelback Road in Phoenix. It was the type of restaurant that cities needed but rarely managed to keep. Affordable prices, genuinely homemade food, service that made you feel welcome regardless of who you were or how much money you had. Sandra Kowalski had inherited the establishment from her father at 35 when he became ill, and had transformed a modest operation into a community institution serving 600 to 800 people per day for breakfast and lunch. She had built a team that was more like family. Cooks who had been there for over a decade, waitresses who had worked at the restaurant while going through college, dishwashers she had helped obtain legal documentation. She paid above minimum wage, offered flexible schedules for parents of young children, and had an explicit zero-tolerance policy for customers who disrespected employees. That policy had cost some customers over the years. Sandra had never regretted any of them. Keisha Williams was 24 years old and had started working at Kowalski's 18 months earlier while completing her business administration's degree at Arizona State University. She was exactly the type of employee Sandra loved hiring: smart, reliable, genuinely good with customers, capable of handling chaotic lunch rushes without losing composure or smile. She had quickly become one of the restaurant's most popular waitresses, with regular customers specifically requesting to sit in her section. On that Friday, Keisha had arrived for the lunch shift at 11 a.m., picked up her usual section of 6 tables, including 3 window booths, and begun what promised to be a normal busy day. At 12:02 p.m., 2 men in ICE vests and tactical clothing entered the restaurant and were directed by the hostess to a window booth in Keisha's section. She had noticed the ICE vests but hadn't paid special attention. She served everyone. Equally, it was simply how she worked. The agents, who would later be identified as Victor Santos and Craig Henderson, sat down and began reviewing menus. Keisha approached within 2 minutes with water and bread, as she did with all tables, and asked if they were ready to order or needed more time. Santos looked at her for a moment with an expression other waitresses who were observing would later describe as deliberately intimidating, then asked where she was from. Keisha said she was from Phoenix. Santos said she didn't look like she was from here. Keisha politely said she had been born at Banner University Medical Center 5 blocks away. Santos said he was asking about her family, where her family was originally from. Keisha, whose grandparents had come to Arizona from Mississippi in the 1950s, said her family was from Arizona and the American South. Santos said she had the look of someone who might not have documentation. Henderson said nothing, but the video captured him, looking at Keisha with an expression of amusement as his partner interrogated her. The implication of what Santos had said took a second for Keisha to process. Then it became completely clear. Santos had looked at a young black American woman serving water in a family restaurant and decided, based on nothing but her appearance, that she was probably an undocumented immigrant. There was nothing in Keisha's behavior, nothing in her speech, nothing in any interaction that had provided any basis for that assumption. She had spoken fluent, unaccented English from the moment she opened her mouth. She had mentioned being born at a specific hospital in Phoenix. She had said her family was from Mississippi and Arizona. There was absolutely nothing that justified the assumption Santos had made beyond Keisha being a black woman in a state with documented history of ICE agents making assumptions about who looked like an immigrant. Keisha calmly said she was an American citizen, had been born in the United States, and asked what they would like to order. Santos said he would need to see identification before she continued serving them. Henderson finally spoke, saying it was standard procedure when there was suspicion of irregular immigration status. Keisha stood still for a moment. She was 24 years old, was at work, wearing a family restaurant uniform in a state where she had lived her entire life, and a federal agent had just said he suspected she was an illegal immigrant based on how she looked. She could have argued, could have confronted. Instead, she said she would be back in a moment and walked to the employee area at the back of the restaurant. Another waitress, Maria Delgado, noticed the expression on Keisha's face and followed her. She found Keisha in the employee bathroom, crying. Not angry crying, the crying of exhaustion of being a young black American woman who had spent her entire life proving she belonged in spaces she had never needed to prove. And yet here, she was at her job, being asked for identification by a government agent because her appearance had led someone to assume she wasn't from here. Maria stayed with Keisha for a minute, then went directly to find Sandra. Sandra was in the back office reviewing supplier orders when Maria came in with an expression Sandra had learned over 17 years of management to immediately recognize. Something had happened to one of her employees, and it wasn't small. Maria explained what she had seen and heard. Sandra was quiet for exactly 3 seconds, then put the clipboard on the desk, took her apron off the hook on the wall, put it on, grabbed her order notebook because she had been a manager long enough to know that documented details mattered, and walked to the front of the restaurant with the stride of someone who had made a decision and there was nothing left to decide. Sandra arrived at the window booth where Santos and Henderson were sitting with an expression that employees who had known her for years later described as the calmest and at the same time most determined they had ever seen on her. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gesture dramatically. She simply stood beside the table, looked directly at Santos, and said she had heard what had happened with her employee and needed to understand what they thought they were doing. Santos said they were just asking routine questions. Sandra asked what specific routine authorized federal agents to demand identification from an American waitress in a private restaurant without any specific cause beyond how she looked. Santos said they had authority to verify immigration status of anyone who raised suspicion. Sandra said Keisha had raised suspicion simply by being black and serving tables in Arizona, and wanted to know if Santos was comfortable saying that out loud in a restaurant full of customers who were clearly hearing every word. Santos was quiet for a moment. Henderson looked out the window. Their silence was all the answer that needed to be said. Sandra hadn't arrived at those agents' booth without having made a quick and precise calculation about exactly what she could and couldn't do. She had managed a restaurant for 17 years, in a state with an intensely politicized immigration environment, had navigated health inspections, labor audits, and difficult customers of every kind. She knew the difference between legitimate federal authority and overreach. ICE agents had authority to conduct immigration operations, but that authority had clearly defined limits by law and judicial precedent. They could enter public establishments like any citizen. But demanding a restaurant employee prove citizenship based solely on racial appearance, without a warrant, without specific articulable cause, without any factual basis beyond how someone looked, was an exercise of legitimate federal authority. It was harassment. And on private property, the owner had the right to protect employees from harassment regardless of who was doing the harassing. Santos tried to reassert authority, saying they were in a public establishment and had the right to ask questions. Sandra said her restaurant was private property open to the public, a legal distinction that mattered enormously, and that as owner and manager, she had a legal obligation to provide a harassment-free work environment for her employees. She said what Santos had done to Keisha, asking where she was from, saying she didn't look like she was from here, and then demanding identification based on racial appearance, constituted harassment based on race and national origin, protected by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. She said she had a lawyer on retainer who knew employment and civil rights law, that she had documented what had happened, and that she hoped they understood they had crossed a line in her establishment. Santos looked at Henderson, clearly not expecting a diner manager to be able to cite specific civil rights legislation. Henderson said they thought they had simply asked routine questions, and if there had been a misunderstanding, they were sorry. Sandra said there was no misunderstanding. There was a 24-year-old employee in the bathroom crying because a federal agent had assumed she was an illegal immigrant based on how she looked. Customer cell phone cameras had been recording for at least 2 minutes at this point. Nobody in the room was pretending not to hear. A family of 4 in the adjacent booth had stopped eating completely. An elderly man, alone near the counter, had turned his chair for a better view. 2 businessmen in suits near the entrance had put their phones on the table and were watching attentively. There was something in the absolute moral clarity of what Sandra was doing, and the composure with which she was doing it, that had captured every person's attention in the restaurant. She wasn't being dramatic, wasn't being aggressive. She was being precise and unwavering, saying exactly what needed to be said without an extra word and without backing down an inch. That kind of moral clarity was rare to see in action, and everyone in the restaurant recognized it when they saw it. Sandra told Santos and Henderson they were welcome to finish the food they had ordered because she wasn't going to let them leave without paying, but that after doing so, she expected them to leave and not return to her establishment. She said if they wanted to eat there again in the future, they would be welcome like any other customer, but any attempt to question employees about immigration, status based on appearance, would be treated as the harassment it was. Santos said they were just doing their job. Sandra said their job didn't include making young Americans cry in employee bathrooms for the crime of being black in Arizona. She turned, went to the register, and personally processed their bill, ensuring the amount was correct to the cent, because she didn't want to give them any additional reason to stay or return. Customers at nearby tables started applauding. Not a huge ovation, but steady and genuine, some customers standing. Santos and Henderson ate the rest of their meal in tense silence, paid, and left without further words. Maria Delgado had returned to the employee bathroom during Sandra's confrontation with the agents to stay with Keisha. She later described being able to hear parts of the exchange through the door, and having told Keisha what was happening as it happened. Keisha had come out of the bathroom when she heard applause begin, not knowing exactly what had caused it. She had walked into the restaurant to see Santos and Henderson walking toward the exit, and Sandra standing near the register with the expression of someone who had done exactly what needed to be done. Keisha had asked what happened. Sandra had said simply that she had asked them to leave. Keisha had looked at Sandra for a moment, then said, "Thank you," in a voice so low that Sandra said she had barely heard it over the restaurant noise that had returned to normal volume. Sandra had said there was nothing to thank her for, that it was exactly what any employer should do, and asked Keisha if she was well enough to continue her shift or needed to go home. Keisha had stayed. She had said she wanted to stay, that going home would have felt like letting something win that didn't deserve to win. She had washed her face, straightened her uniform, and returned to her section with the same professionalism she had demonstrated all morning. Customers who had watched the entire exchange treated her with additional solicitude for the rest of the shift, several leaving tips significantly larger than normal, some stopping to say words of support when leaving. An older woman had taken Keisha's hand and said what Sandra had done was what all employers should do, and that she was clearly an extraordinary employee at an extraordinary restaurant. Keisha had thanked her with a smile that, according to Maria, who was watching, looked genuine for the first time since the agents had entered. Nobody in the restaurant had filmed intentionally to create viral content. The 4 customers who had recorded had done so by instinct, sensing they were witnessing something significant that should be documented. But when those videos hit social media throughout that afternoon, the world watched. The first video was posted at 2:17 p.m. by a customer named David Park, a 41-year-old accountant who had been eating lunch alone near the window booth. He had written a simple caption: "Restaurant manager in Phoenix tells ICE agents to leave after they harassed black waitress." In 3 hours, it had 2 million views. By evening, it had 50 million. By the next day, it had crossed 100 million. Not because there was violence, not because there was dramatic confrontation, but because there was something powerful and rare in what the video showed. An ordinary person with less institutional power than those she was confronting doing the right thing in a calm, precise, and absolutely unwavering way. Sandra was at home when she began to realize the magnitude of what was happening. Her 20-year-old daughter had called saying the restaurant video was everywhere. Sandra had checked her phone and found 847 notifications on the restaurant's social media account that normally received maybe 5 per day. Messages were coming in from across the country, from people who had seen the video and wanted to say what she had done mattered. She had sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, reading messages, thinking about Keisha in the bathroom, crying, thinking about the 17 years it had taken to build that restaurant into a place where every employee knew they were protected. She hadn't expelled those agents to go viral. She had done it because she was the manager, and those were her employees, and none of them should have to endure that to earn a paycheck. But if the fact that she had done it inspired others to do the same, then there was something good coming out of something that had started as something very, very bad. The morning after the incident brought a completely different reality to Kowalski's Diner. Sandra had arrived at 5:30 a.m., as always, to prepare for opening, and found something she had never seen in the restaurant's 23 years of existence: a line of people waiting outside before it even opened. It wasn't a small line. There were 72 people waiting when she unlocked the door at 6 a.m., some who had clearly arrived well before opening time, some carrying handwritten signs saying things like "Kowalski's, where everyone is welcome," and "Sandra Kowalski, Phoenix Hero." Sandra had stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at those people, feeling the weight of what had overnight become something much larger than her or her restaurant. She had taken a deep breath, opened the door fully, and said the coffee was fresh, and there was a table for everyone. The restaurant stayed at maximum capacity all day, with a line outside that never completely diminished. They served over 1,200 people that Saturday, nearly double their previous record. Keisha had arrived for her shift that Saturday and frozen when she saw the line. Sandra had found her in the parking lot and explained what was happening. Keisha had looked at the line for a long moment, then said something Sandra would repeat in multiple interviews in the months that followed. Keisha had said she had spent her life being invisible in the wrong places and visible in the wrong places too, and that she didn't know exactly what to do with being visible this way, the right way. Sandra had said she didn't need to do anything beyond what she always did, that she was excellent at her job, and those people had come because they wanted to support a place that treated employees with dignity, not to see Keisha as spectacle. That distinction had mattered to Keisha. She had gone in, put on her apron, and worked the shift with the same grace and professionalism that had characterized every previous shift, though that day many customers had recognized her and stopped to say words of support she had received with a genuine smile and sincere thank you. Media coverage exploded throughout the weekend. Virtually every major national news outlet had covered the story by Sunday. The angle varied. Some focused on Sandra as unlikely hero, diner manager who had faced armed federal agents with nothing but knowledge of law and moral determination. Others focused on Keisha as representation of the broader experience of Black Americans being presumed foreigners in a country where their families had lived for generations. Still others focused on broader legal questions about ICE authority on private property and legal limits of immigration status checks without specific cause. Law professors at universities being consulted explained that what Santos had done in demanding identification from Keisha based on racial appearance without any other specific cause was in deeply problematic legal territory, potentially, constituting violation of Fourth Amendment protection against detention without reasonable cause and 14th Amendment discrimination based on race. ICE's response was revealing in its inadequacy. A spokesperson issued a statement saying the agency took misconduct allegations seriously and that the incident was being reviewed internally. There was no acknowledgement that something had gone wrong, no apology to Keisha, no commitment to specific action. It was generic corporate language designed to sound responsive without committing to anything concrete. The statement was widely ridiculed online as exactly the kind of non-responsive response that allowed a culture of impunity to flourish within law enforcement agencies. Members of Congress from both parties, though for different reasons, called for explanations. Senators who were critics of ICE used the incident as evidence of need for stricter oversight. Senators who generally supported aggressive immigration enforcement distanced themselves from the specific incident, saying, if the facts were as reported, then it had been clear misconduct. ICE's internal investigation was formally opened Monday after the incident, but what had begun as an internal review quickly expanded when civil rights organizations began presenting evidence that the incident with Keisha wasn't isolated. The American Civil Liberties Union had tracked 34 similar incidents in the past 2 years in Arizona and neighboring states where employees of restaurants, stores, and other commercial establishments had been questioned about immigration status based on racial appearance. In 31 of the 34 cases, employees questioned were people of color, predominantly Black and Latino. In 28 cases, employees were native-born American citizens. In no case had there been any specific cause beyond appearance for questioning. The data painted a picture of a systematic pattern of racial profiling being used by ICE agents in Arizona well beyond the Keisha incident. A pattern that had been happening without accountability because previous victims hadn't had a Sandra Kowalski to publicly defend them. Lawyers specializing in employment rights and immigration proactively contacted Sandra, offering pro bono representation for any legal action she or Keisha wanted to take. Civil rights organizations offered resources and support. The ACLU requested a meeting with Sandra and Keisha to discuss the broader case. Sandra, who had consulted her retainer lawyer immediately after the incident, had meticulously documented everything: precise timeline of events, written statements from Maria Delgado, and 3 other employees who had witnessed the interaction, names of customers who had watched and potentially filmed, and crucially, had preserved footage from the restaurant's internal security cameras that had captured everything from a different angle than the cell phone videos that had gone viral. Those security cameras showed what cell phone videos didn't clearly show: the expression on Santos' face when he had first looked at Keisha, the exact moment when he had decided to question her, and the complete absence of any behavior on Keisha's part that could have justified legitimate suspicion. Keisha had made a difficult decision about how to respond to public attention. She had received dozens of interview requests from outlets across the country. Her first instinct had been to refuse everything, preserve privacy, not become the face of something that had made her feel victimized rather than empowered. But after talking with family, with Sandra, and with a civil rights attorney she had contacted, she had arrived at a different perspective. She had said in her first interview with a reporter from the Arizona Republic that she had initially wanted to disappear from all the attention because the incident had been humiliating and re-traumatizing in ways that people who had never experienced it would have difficulty understanding. But she had realized staying silent would allow the narrative of the incident to be told by others rather than by her. There were 34 other similar cases, and those victims had no platform. If she spoke not just for herself. The Arizona Republic interview was published Thursday, 6 days after the incident. Keisha had spoken with clarity and precision about what she had felt when Santos had asked where she was from, what had gone through her mind when he had said she had the look of someone without documentation, the familiar exhaustion of having to prove she belonged in spaces in her own country. She had spoken about growing up in Phoenix as daughter and granddaughter of Arizonans, about studying at ASU, about plans to open her own business after graduation, about how no amount of education or achievement seemed to guarantee complete protection against assumptions people made based on appearance. She had spoken about Sandra not as hero but as employer who had done what all employers should do, and rarely did: defend an employee when the employee couldn't defend herself without potentially higher personal cost. The interview had been read over 2 million times online in the first 24 hours. Sandra had given her own interview the same day to USA Today. She had said something reporters had reproduced in countless subsequent articles about the case. When asked what she had been thinking when she had walked toward those agents' booth, Sandra had said she hadn't been thinking about consequences, hadn't been thinking about going viral, hadn't been thinking about anything except that one of her employees was crying in the bathroom and she was the person responsible for that establishment. And there was one simple thing that needed to be done. She had said managers who needed to think very hard about whether to defend employees when employees were being harassed probably shouldn't be managers. That statement, simple and direct like Sandra herself, had become one of the most shared of the entire case coverage. The ICE internal investigation expanded rapidly when investigators began reviewing Santos and Henderson's complete histories. What they found was disturbing in its consistency. Santos had accumulated 7 formal complaints in his 8 years as an agent, 5 of them involving allegations that he had approached people of color in private commercial establishments without specific cause beyond appearance. In each previous case, internal investigations had concluded Santos had exercised reasonable judgment based on experiential indicators, a phrase external investigators now interpreted as administrative cover for systematic racial profiling. Henderson had a less extensive but equally concerning history. 4 complaints in 6 years, 3 involving approaches to employees of color on private property. In both cases, the pattern was unmistakable. They consistently targeted non-white people in spaces where white people doing identical activities were left completely alone. The question the investigation faced wasn't whether racial profiling had occurred. It was why it had occurred dozens of times without resulting in serious consequence for either agent. The answer to that question emerged through supervisor depositions. Santos and Henderson's immediate supervisor, Special Agent in Charge Richard Porter, had been aware of multiple complaints against both agents but had systematically minimized each one. His management philosophy, which became clear through internal emails discovered during investigation, was that aggressive agents produced more detentions, and more detentions was how success was measured and rewarded within his division. Porter had implemented an informal metric system where agents with higher numbers of investigative contacts received more favorable performance evaluations, without distinction about whether those contacts had been based on legitimate suspicion or racial profiling. Santos had consistently had some of the highest numbers in the division. Those numbers had been treated as evidence of diligence rather than as warning signs of problematic behavior. Porter had created an environment where agents knew aggressive results were rewarded, and that complaints from people who were targets of that aggressiveness would be treated as bureaucratic noise rather than legitimate feedback. Santos's depositions during investigation were revealing in ways his lawyers clearly hadn't anticipated. When asked directly what had specifically led him to suspect Keisha, Santos initially tried the familiar argument that he had experience recognizing people who were nervous or avoiding eye contact. Investigators showed him restaurant security footage from the 2 minutes before Santos approached Keisha, which showed her walking toward their table with a professional smile, making normal eye contact, behaving exactly like a waitress going to take an order. There was no sign of nervousness or avoidance behavior. Santos then tried to say something about the general context had drawn his attention. Investigators asked what specifically in the context had been different for Keisha's table versus other tables in the same restaurant. Santos couldn't identify anything specific. When investigators showed footage of white waitresses serving nearby tables in the same circumstances without being approached by Santos, he was silent for a long moment before saying he had exercised judgment based on experience. Investigators asked in what part of his experience he had learned that being black and serving tables in Arizona was an indicator of possible irregular immigration status. Santos couldn't answer. Henderson had tried a different strategy, arguing that Santos had been the one who initiated questioning and that he had merely supported his partner as protocol required. But footage showed Henderson making eye contact with Santos in a way that multiple customer testimonies described as encouraging when Santos had made the first comment about Keisha's appearance. And the expression of amusement multiple witnesses had described seeing on Henderson's face while Santos interrogated Keisha was clearly captured on the restaurant's internal security cameras Sandra had preserved. Henderson hadn't merely followed his partner out of professional duty. He had watched a young woman being humiliated and had considered it entertainment. That moral distinction mattered enormously, both in terms of individual culpability and in terms of what it revealed about the culture within their division. Porter, the supervisor, faced even more severe questioning. Investigators presented him with Santos's complete stop data over 8 years, showing that 89% of all his investigative contacts at private establishments had involved people of color, despite Arizona being a state where people of color constituted approximately 42% of the population. The numbers were mathematically impossible to attribute to coincidence or to legitimate crime patterns. When investigators asked Porter how he had interpreted that data over the years, he said he had seen Santos as a particularly effective agent working in areas with high concentration of irregular immigration activity. Investigators asked how he had determined which areas had high concentration of irregular immigration activity. Porter paused a long time before admitting it was based primarily on the agent's own reports about where they were conducting contacts. The circle was complete and perfect in its circularity. Agents targeted certain areas based on prejudice, reported those areas as having high activity. Supervisors sent them back to those same areas based on those reports, and the cycle continued indefinitely without any external verification. The civil lawsuit was filed by Keisha and Kowalski's restaurant 3 weeks after the incident. The petition was elegant in its precision. For Keisha personally, it argued violation of Fourth Amendment, protection against detention without reasonable cause, 14th Amendment discrimination based on race and national origin, and violation of federal civil rights statutes prohibiting discrimination based on race in public accommodations. For the restaurant, it argued interference with employment relationship, creating a hostile work environment through governmental action, and violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, protecting employees from race-based harassment in the workplace regardless of the conduct's origin. The lawsuit named Santos and Henderson personally, Porter as negligent supervisor, ICE as agency, and the Department of Homeland Security. Damages sought reflected not only individual suffering, but measurable economic costs, emotional impact on Keisha, potential damage to her professional reputation, and costs Kowalski's had incurred, responding to the incident, including management time and legal consultation. The government tried to argue qualified immunity for Santos, and Henderson, arguing that the law about when agents could request identification from employees of private establishments wasn't clearly established in a way reasonable agents should have known. Federal Judge Miriam Chen, assigned to the case, rejected the argument in a decision widely praised by legal experts as a model of clear reasoning about qualified immunity. Judge Chen wrote that an American citizen's right not to be detained and interrogated about immigration status based solely on racial appearance had been established by sufficiently clear precedent that any reasonable agent should have known Santos's conduct violated a clearly established right. She pointed out that even if there were ambiguity about specific immigration law, anti-discrimination law clearly established that differential treatment based on race was unconstitutional in virtually any context. Demanding identification from a black employee while not doing the same for white colleagues in identical circumstances was racial discrimination so direct that qualified immunity simply didn't apply. The lawsuit's discovery revealed documents that made the government's position increasingly untenable. There was an ICE training manual that explicitly specified that racial appearance alone was never sufficient basis for approaching someone for immigration status verification, that agents needed specific articulable cause based on observed behavior rather than physical characteristics. Santos had completed training using that manual, had signed a document acknowledging he had understood the principles, had then systematically violated those principles in 17 documented contacts over 8 years without serious consequences. Discovery showed the problem wasn't lack of training on correct rules. It was that the system had sent a message through rewards and consequences that the rules didn't need to be followed when they resulted in lower numbers. Santos had learned that the manual said one thing and that rewarded practice said something completely different. Porter had created an environment where rewarded practice was what mattered, and the manual was a technicality experienced agents learned to ignore. While the lawsuit advanced, something unexpected had begun happening at the restaurant. Kowalski's had become a destination, Not a tourist destination in the conventional sense, but a place people traveled specifically to visit because what had happened there had resonated with experiences they had had or witnessed. Sandra began receiving letters from business owners across the country, asking how she had had the clarity to act the way she had, asking for advice on how to build similar employee protection policies. She had answered every letter personally because she considered genuine questions deserving genuine answers. She had consistently said the same thing. There was no secret, no special policy. There was only a clear decision that no employee should ever have, to stand alone when being treated in a way that violated their dignity. That decision, made 17 years earlier when she had taken over her father's restaurant, had been the only preparation she had needed that Friday. 7 months after the incident, settlement negotiations entered their final phase, with the government making an offer that reflected both the overwhelming strength of evidence and the political and public pressure the case had generated. The direct compensation offer was $1.4 million specifically for Keisha, a number her lawyers described as recognition of constitutional rights violation, documented emotional suffering, and potential long-term impact on the career trajectory of a young woman who had been presumed an illegal immigrant at her own job. Kowalski's would receive separate compensation of $340,000 for interference with employment relations and costs incurred responding to the incident. But, as in all cases of this nature that Sandra and Keisha's lawyers had carefully studied, financial compensation was only the minor part of what mattered. The systemic reforms were where the settlement would find its true and lasting legacy. Santos would be permanently fired with federal law enforcement certification revoked, making any future employment in any law enforcement capacity at any federal or state agency impossible. Henderson would receive equally permanent termination, with the same certification consequences. Porter, the supervisor who had created a metric system that had rewarded discriminatory behavior over years, would be forced into early retirement with substantial loss of benefits and a permanent note in his file documenting supervisory failure that had contributed to systematic violation of civil rights of multiple American citizens over 8 years. His prospects for any future employment in law enforcement supervision were effectively zero. The settlement also required the specific ICE division in Arizona to undergo comprehensive external audit of all investigative contacts from the past 3 years, with public data on racial disparities and who had been approached and why. The training reform was comprehensive in ways that went well beyond what Sandra or Keisha had initially hoped to achieve. ICE would be required to develop a new specific training module on operations in private property, with particular focus on constitutional limits of immigration status checks and absolute prohibition on using racial appearance as a basis for suspicion. Critical was that training would be developed in collaboration with external civil rights organizations outside ICE, not by internal personnel who had demonstrated capacity to create manuals with correct rules while simultaneously rewarding violation of those rules. Training would include a case study based specifically on the Kowalski's incident, with all details of how Santos had targeted Keisha and how Judge Chen had analyzed the violation, making it impossible for future agents to claim they didn't understand why that type of behavior was illegal and unacceptable. The new performance metric system was perhaps the most transformative reform component. Thus, the settlement required complete elimination of any performance evaluation system that rewarded gross volume of investigative contacts without waiting for the quality and legality of those contacts. The replacement system would evaluate agents on multiple dimensions, including compliance with constitutional protocols, quality of submitted reports, feedback from supervisors who had observed contacts, and absence of sustained complaints. Agents with histories of similar complaints would no longer be automatically promoted, as Santos had been throughout his career, despite accumulating complaints. The system would be audited externally by an independent panel annually, with results published publicly to create transparency that had been completely absent. The central idea was simple but revolutionary within the ICE culture Porter had cultivated. Number of detentions wasn't a measure of success if those detentions were achieved through violation of constitutional rights. Keisha was consulted on every component of the settlement by her lawyers before accepting. She had spent weeks thinking about what she wanted the outcome to be, talking with family, with professors at ASU who mentored her, with Sandra, who had become a mentor figure in her life, in a way neither of them had planned when Keisha had shown up for a job interview 18 months earlier. Keisha had developed a clear vision of what the settlement needed to achieve, to be worth accepting, rather than going to trial. It needed to remove Santos and Henderson from positions where they could harm others. It needed to hold Porter accountable for creating the environment that had enabled their behavior. It needed to change the training system in a way that prevented future agents from learning that racial profiling was acceptable practice. And it needed to create transparency through public data that made discriminatory patterns visible rather than hidden in internal reports supervisors like Porter could ignore indefinitely. When her lawyers confirmed the settlement met each of those criteria, Keisha said she was ready to sign. Sandra had made a separate but related decision about what to do with the restaurant's compensation. She had consulted with accountant, with lawyer, and with staff, and had reached the conclusion that the money belonged to the community that had supported the restaurant so extraordinarily after the incident. She established the Kowalski's Employee Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing resources for low-income employees experiencing harassment or workplace discrimination who couldn't afford lawyers. The fund would provide free legal consultation, documentation support for employees wanting to file formal complaints, and in deserving cases, direct legal representation. Sandra had seen how many of the 34 victims of similar incidents the ACLU had documented had never received any accountability because they simply hadn't had resources to fight back. The fund would try to change that calculation, making legal protection less a function of who you knew or how much money you had. The press conference announcing the settlement happened at Kowalski's Diner, a deliberate decision by Sandra, who had said she wanted the place where it occurred to be the place where accountability was announced. She had closed the restaurant to customers that morning, but had invited full staff to be present, every waitress, every cook, every dishwasher who had been there that Friday, or heard about what had happened. They were present when Keisha and Sandra positioned themselves before cameras with lawyers and representatives from civil rights organizations that had supported the case. Keisha spoke first. She said that when she had gone into the employee bathroom that Friday, she had felt as if the world had confirmed something she had been taught to fear, but never accept. That regardless of what she achieved, regardless of where she was born or grew, there were people with authority who would always see her first as a threat to be verified, rather than a person to be respected. She said she had spent hours in that bathroom thinking about what she had done wrong to deserve that. And the answer had been nothing. Absolutely nothing. Keisha then said something that had silenced the room completely. She said that when she had come out of the bathroom and seen Sandra walking toward that booth with that expression of absolute determination, she had felt something she hadn't felt very often in that specific context. She had felt that someone in a position of power had chosen to use that power to protect her rather than ignore what was happening because it was more convenient. She said that feeling, as simple and direct as it was, had been profoundly powerful. Not because it was extraordinary that someone defended her, but because it had been rare enough that when it happened, it had felt extraordinary. And that rarity, that surprise of being defended when it should be basic expectation, was the real problem she hoped the settlement and reforms would begin to address. Sandra spoke afterward, more briefly. She said Kowalski's had been built on a simple premise, that every person who walked through the door, whether customer or employee, deserved to be treated with complete dignity. She said she had done nothing on Friday beyond applying that premise, and that it had been simultaneously gratifying and disturbing that applying such a basic premise had generated so much. Gratifying because it showed people wanted to see dignity defended. Disturbing because it showed how rarely it happened, that when it did, it became national news. She had looked at her employees gathered in the room and said each of them deserved an employer willing to do what she had done, and hoped the settlement and attention it had generated would make that standard more common,